A very warm welcome to this breakfast seminar co-organized by PRIO and the World Wildlife Fund Norway. We're especially pleased to welcome our guest of honor, Steven Pinker, who will also be delivering the PRIO annual peace address later today. And a particular thank to World Wildlife Fund Norway for co-hosting this event with PRIO. My name is Henrik Uland. I'm the director of PRIO. This seminar is part of the 60th anniversary events that are taking place this week, celebrating the foundation of PRIO in 1959. One key to the Institute's longevity is that we persistently strive to direct our research towards topics and themes that are relevant for the current policy agenda. The topic of today is the environment, and I think I can safely say that this is an issue that policymakers have at the forefront of their minds at present. In particular, our panelists will be discussing how we should relate to today's environmental challenges. The Swedish youth activist Greta Thunberg has called for panic in the face of impending environmental catastrophe. Professor Pinker has taken a different tack, arguing instead for optimism in the light of the power of science and technology to solve major societal problems. Discussing this thorny issue with Professor Pinker on today's panel will be Secretary General of World Wildlife Fund Norway, Bård Vegar Solhjell, Research Professor at PRIO, Halvard Buhaug, and Associate Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at Clark University, Elisabeth Gilmore. The discussion will be moderated by the political editor of Aftenposten, Trine Eilertsen. But first, I'm very happy to hand the floor over to the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ine Eriksen Søreide. Please, Ine.
Thank you very much, Henrik, and thank you also for this invitation to a breakfast seminar. I have a lot of experience in breakfast seminars, which means that you will never have breakfast, so I had breakfast before I came. And when I look at the menu, I do think that maybe that was the healthier choice today, even though, of course, you absolutely deserve your cinnamon buns, of course. First of all, let me say happy birthday. I know that this is not necessarily the day, but it's around the date, sometime in June. So I really then dare to say happy birthday and happy 60th anniversary. And I would like to take just one moment to thank all of you here at PRIO. For 6 decades, you have helped us to make sense of the world. And on behalf of past, and I can say that now since I have one former foreign minister here as well. So on behalf of past, present, and also future foreign ministers, I would like to thank PRIO for informing the debate in the Norwegian society, for helping us understand the past and also making us better equipped to understand the future. And shying away from the difficult debates has really never been your style. And getting older, you are, if anything, getting even more bold and more outspoken. That's also very typical for family members getting older. The odd uncle is always the one giving the most inappropriate comments at dinners. You are not there yet, but I just want to say that being older and being bolder is something that absolutely suits you. So over the past few months, I think many people have been inspired by the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg. And young people around the world have taken to the streets. They are demonstrating. They are impatient. They want action. And they are looking at us as decision makers to take that action. The Fridays for the Future movement has really become, I would say, a force to be reckoned with. I don't think any one of us, especially us in decision-making positions, can disregard the fact that she is absolutely setting the agenda. And I suspect that Greta Thunberg has also inspired the headline for today's breakfast seminar, Reason for Optimism or Reason to Panic. Because in the words of Greta Thunberg, she says, I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear that I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is. And of course, when teenagers and also many others across the world take to the streets to tell us and to tell adults that we have to act on something, we more or less have no choice. We all have to listen, we all have to act. However, I believe that optimism, as well as panic, can be a driver for change. The goal should be the same both for young demonstrators and for climate activists of an older age and for politicians, that we need to take action to combat climate change. But we have different roles to play, and we also have different tools in our toolboxes. One thing I can tell you, and I think I will have, I think that Espen will join me in this, that a politician that panics is usually not a very effective politician. So we have to use other means. And in his two latest books, Professor Pinker has been telling us that the world is actually getting better. And he's right. If you look at the number of conflicts in the world, it is declining. If you're looking at global poverty, it has been reduced. If you look at child mortality rates, they're also going down. Life expectancy is going up. The number of children, especially girls in schools, are increasing. I could go on. The point, however, is that on one specific topic, namely climate change, it's going in the opposite direction. The call for that urgent action to avoid the terrible consequences of environmental degradation is backed by clear scientific evidence. And I do not feel the need to use all of your time to talk about all the reports that has come out, but let me just mention the IPCC panel. They spelled out very clearly the dangers of surpassing the 1.5 degree goal. It is also made clear that emissions must be cut rapidly and drastically by 2030 in order to avoid this. We also have reports that have come out on the loss of biodiversity, which is equally important and equally disturbing. So to take action, we have to look at both the local level and the global level. Policies, efforts, and actions has to be taken. But these changes will not happen by themselves. And this is where I may be disagreeing a bit with Greta Thunberg and others, who more or less needs everyone to panic. We're not going to be very effective if we panic. But one other thing is important to underline. And that is that policies still matter. We can still change things by policies. And you sometimes get the impression, when you look around the world and the global environment today, that it's impossible to make changes by policies. That's wrong. It is possible if we decide to do so. So we have to have a functioning multilateral system to make this work. In just a few days, I'm presenting a white paper to the Parliament on these issues. And I'm not going to go through that one now because we don't have time for that. But you will have plenty of time to dive into that white paper later. The point of the paper is the following, very quickly summarized. We need more global cooperation, and we need more of it now. Also, another fact that is very important to underline, we need to reform the system. Because if the system is felt irrelevant and not representative, we will not be able to use it as a tool that we could. So let me just end by pointing to one huge paradox that I also think will be very important for the issues of climate change and how to combat climate change. I had not expected, when I took office as a foreign minister in 2017, that I would spend equal amounts of time, or I would say even more time, in defending the achievements that we have already made, instead of using or spending time in achieving or laying out new visions for bold new steps to push the agenda forward. But the fact of the matter is that when big countries who until now were drivers, for instance, in the climate change debate and trying to turn things around, when they are withdrawing or pulling back from international agreements or from their engagement, of course, our time needs to be spent to find a strategy to avoid that from being a big problem. And we have to use much of our capacity and resources in trying as best as we can to fight for the norms that we have achieved already. And we see this on multiple fronts. This is not only an issue on climate change. We see it on sexual and reproductive health rights. We see it on human rights. We see it on basically almost every field you can imagine. And when you see that populism and protectionism is influencing a lot of the national policies around the world, you also see that the results can be very different from what we expected 5 or 10 years ago, or even 3 years ago. I think that much of the optimism that has been so vital for all of us for such a long time, where we expected the progress to be linear and go straight up, that is broken and that is changed as we see it right now. But despite of these backlashes, I want to leave you with an optimistic point of view, because there is always a glimmer of hope. I think that people are becoming increasingly aware of the threats, the challenges, and they are also increasingly interested in doing something about it, on a local level, on a global level. So I am an optimist by nature. You have to work hard to get me to become a pessimist or to make me panic. Of course, that happens occasionally from time to time. But I believe that our shared destiny on this fragile planet will become more important for all of us in the years to come, and we have to undertake joint strategies in order to take collective action against climate change. I wish you a wonderful birthday party with more cinnamon buns and other things, I don't know. And of course, the panel, who is really one of the best panels I've seen for a long time on these issues. So I'm wishing you all the best for the day.
Thank you very much, Ine, for those kind words on PRIO's role. We will, I promise, we will continue to be the constructive, critical voice and try our best to not degrade into that odd uncle. And then thank you also very much for the substantive comments on the topic of today, which were very appropriate. I'm going now to leave the floor to Trine Eilertsen to head the debate. Trine is, as you all know, an important political commentator in Norway and Aftenposten, and she will be handling this discussion from here.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to this interesting panel. We will do it like this. First, we will listen to Steven Pinker. He'll speak for about 15 minutes. 15, not 50. And then our 3 other guests will comment for 5 minutes, and then we'll try to facilitate a conversation to get some steps further on these very interesting topics. And some of the headlines here are: what are the major valid environmental concerns today? And of course, that's a big question. And the question is, do we answer them quickly enough, or do we pick the right concerns? And what can be said about the ability of humanity to address and adapt to these challenges? And that's one of your specialties, Steven Pinker. So I just give the stage to you.
Thank you. Okay, happy birthday, PRIO. Thanks to all of you for coming and organizing this meeting. I'm going to discuss the broadest possible view of the environmental challenges, problems, crises, and how we ought to face them. We'll begin with points of that I assume are in complete agreement, that the environment is undergoing severe damage. There's a non-negligible risk of catastrophe, particularly from climate change, and that our current institutions and practices are not sufficient to deal with these challenges. The question is, what do we do about them now? And I've called in my book, Enlightenment Now, for rethinking what I think is the orthodox environmentalist ideology for the last 40 years, which I sometimes call romantic environmentalism or 1970s greenism. I think the purest embodiment of this philosophy of environmentalists comes from Pope Francis, who wrote an encyclical, Laudato Si, 4 years ago that states it in particularly pure form. The precepts of romantic environmentalism are that the earth, first of all, is a pristine innocent, defiled by human rapacity. To quote the Pope, "Our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, who now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her." Second, that the harm is uniformly getting worse and worse. As he put it, the earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. That the root cause is the Enlightenment commitment to reason, science, and progress. As in his words, scientific and technological progress cannot be equated with the progress of humanity and history. And that the solution is some kind of spiritual awakening. The way to a better future lies elsewhere, namely in an appreciation of the mysterious network of relations between things and the treasure of Christian spiritual experience. And repentance, that we must pursue depopulation, degrowth, and deindustrialization, or we will be punished for our sins in a dreadful environmental judgment day. Now, debating a man who is infallible must be the ultimate exercise in futility. But I will proceed. I think there are problems with, I don't know how that cue keeps getting in there, but I think that there are problems with this as an overall philosophy of environmentalism. One is that a lot of the traditional green rhetoric has an indifference to human suffering, to starvation, disease, and extreme poverty, which are often alleviated by activities that trade off with harm to the environment. There's a certain misanthropy that runs through romantic environmentalism. This might be an extreme quote, but there are others like it. We need to radically and intelligently reduce human populations to fewer than 1 billion. Curing a body of cancer requires radical and invasive therapy, and therefore curing the biosphere of the human virus will also require a radical and invasive approach. There's a kind of fatalism that is often associated with green environmentalist rhetoric that, as I satirize it here, that we are all going to suffer a horrible apocalypse unless we immediately take extreme measures which we have no chance whatsoever of taking. Now, what is the logical response to the belief that we are doomed, that nothing we can do can avert a catastrophe? The logical response is to enjoy life while we can, since activism would be a waste of time. This is not just fanciful. A 2013 survey showed that among people who agree with the statement, "Our way of life will probably end in a century," a majority also endorsed the view that the world's future looks grim, so we have to focus on looking after ourselves and those we love. And that is not a recipe for improvement of the environment or anything else. And I think we all agree that the kind of steps that ought to be taken have not been taken, that there is an ineffectiveness to current environmental rhetoric, that the typical response of many politicians, many members of the public, is that if we have to choose between poverty and pollution, we'll live with the pollution. If, despite 50 years of environmentalism, nothing is improved, then environmental protection accomplishes nothing but expense and inconvenience. Let's have someone else make the sacrifices, or let's hope the experts are wrong. So, is there an alternative philosophy of environmentalism? I think there is. It goes by a number of names, none of which have really caught on. Eco-modernism, eco-pragmatism, humanistic environmentalism, sometimes called the blue-green movement or the turquoise movement. And there's a conference at Cambridge a couple of years ago with the hashtag Earth Optimism, although I think that optimism itself doesn't capture the idea that I would like to endorse exactly. It's not that we should look on the bright side, but rather we should acknowledge progress that has been made where it has been made, and acknowledge the threats where the threats exist, but also concentrate on which steps would actually avert the catastrophes. And so let me expand a little on that. I am not responsible for eco-modernism, eco-pragmatism, any of this. There's an eco-modernist manifesto that came out 3 years ago. You can get online. A wonderful book by Stuart Brand, who famously wrote the Whole Earth Catalog in the 1970s, and more recently has a book called The Whole Earth Discipline. I've tried to convey these ideas in my own book, Enlightenment Now. So the key ideas are, first of all, that we have to acknowledge that industrialization has brought many gifts. It has fed billions, it has doubled human lifespans, it's decimated extreme poverty, which has fallen from 90% of the world's population to 10%. By replacing muscle with machinery, industrialization helped to end slavery, helped to emancipate women from kitchen slavery, and helped to educate children, because it was more valuable for children to be in school than on farms. And it has improved life in countless ways. We can read at night, we can live where we want, we can stay warm in winter, we can see the world, we can multiply human contact. So these are good things, and some pollution is inevitable, and it may even be a price worth paying. As the economist Robert Frank put it, there's an optimum amount of pollution in the environment, just as there is an optimum amount of dirt in your house. Cleaner is better, but not at the expense of everything else in life. Second, in general, economic development is good. Good for the environment. Rich societies can afford to pay for a cleaner environment. Environmental protection is something of a luxury. Most people, I think including most of us, if we had to choose between doing without electricity and having electricity with smog, we'll go for the electricity and smog. But as societies become more affluent, they are better equipped to pay for more expensive electricity that they can get without the smog. So being richer is better. And according to the World Values Survey, in addition to this purely practical benefit of affluence in protecting the environment, namely you can afford to pay for pollution control, people's values change as their societies become more affluent. It also goes together with education. People put a higher value on the environment as their countries get richer, on average. And technological progress is good. It alters the trade-offs. That is, if our choice is always how to get more calories and lumens and BTUs and bits and miles with less pollution, water, and habitat destruction, technology, even though that trade-off is inherent, technology shifts the trade-off. We can get more of what we want with less damage. This includes pollution control technologies, scrubbers and catalytic converters, but also processes that affect the environment just as dramatically but more indirectly, such as densification, having humans produce what they need on less land and less water. Through urbanization, urbanization is good for the environment. Precision farming, growing more food on less land, tree plantations, and so on. And by the process of dematerialization, where we get what we want with fewer atoms and more bits. The paradigm case being the 50 or so appliances that have all been replaced by a smartphone. Many people now no longer have a camera and a shelf full of stationery and a radio and a telephone and an alarm clock and a subscription to the newspaper and radio and VCR and so on, because all of these, each one of these has been replaced by a single app on the same little hunk of matter. So these are some of the ideas behind eco-pragmatism or eco-modernism. The question is, can it work? Have there been any improvements in the environment as a result of these changes, societies getting richer, technology advancing? And there are. I mean, there are many environmental crises, but if the dominant dominant narrative is that everything is getting worse, then that can sap any energy to try to make things better. What's the point if, despite 40 years of environmental activism, the environment is just getting worse and worse? And the environment is getting worse in many aspects, but is also getting better in some aspects. According to the Environmental Performance Index, an annual report card of the country's environmental quality coming out of Yale University, over in a 10-year comparison of 180 countries, 178 of them improved in their environmental quality. And it's the richer countries that have the cleaner environments. There have been successes, some successes in conservation, and for that we have the World Wildlife Fund to thank. That species that were on the brink of extinction are now on the verge of being rescued. Albatrosses, condors, oryxes, pandas, rhinoceroses, devils, tigers, and there undoubtedly are others. In wealthy countries, urban waterways have become vastly cleaner. This is a picture that I took of my backyard, Boston Harbor, which became famous in 1988 when George H.W. Bush staged a publicity stunt of taking a boat ride in Boston Harbor to embarrass his opponent, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, because at the time Boston Harbor was the most polluted harbor in the country. Thanks to these sewage treatment plants, it is now one of the cleanest, and this is true in virtually every city in developed countries, that their air and water quality have improved over 40 years. This is a graph from the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, which shows that since the EPA was founded in 1970, the American population has increased by 40%. GDP has increased by a factor of 2.5. Americans drive twice as many miles as they did in 1970, but the emissions of the 5 major air pollutants are down by an average of 60%. Just another couple of examples that the amount of, this is another graph of GDP in the United States. This is the amount of meat that Americans eat, not a good trend. On the other hand, this is the amount of land that is used to produce meat that's gone down as meat production has gone up. This shows just how much, for the world, not the United States, how many tons of cereal can be produced on a fixed amount of land. So more food, less land. Because in particular in temperate regions, farmland is being abandoned with more efficient farming and has been reclaimed by forest, and new forests aren't being cut down at the same rate. The rate of deforestation in temperate regions has fallen to 0, and in some places negative. This is not true of tropical regions, but at least the rate of deforestation is down from its peak in the 1980s. And indeed, Jesse Ausubel of Rockefeller University has shown that we may have hit peak use of a number of resources, that plotting the consumption by the world as a whole, we may have reached peak farmland, peak timber, peak paper, peak car, maybe even peak stuff. That 89 out of 100 resources that Ausubel plotted show that the use of resources has peaked or is peaking. In the UK, for example, in the year 2000, a typical Briton consumed 12 tons of stuff in a year. That's down to 9 tons. So it is not true that in a strange proposition that is agreed to both by the hardcore libertarian right and the hardcore green left, that you can have economic growth or you can protect the environment, but you can't have both. What some of these graphs show is that thanks to technology and densification and dematerialization, there can be economic growth with combined with environmental protection. Just to give a couple of other examples, the amount of oil shipped by sea has drastically increased since 1970, but the number of oil spills has drastically decreased. And the oil spill is almost the prototypical environmental insult. It was the symbol of environmental degradation in the 1970s and 1980s. Protected areas have doubled, 15% of the Earth's surface and 12% of the oceans. There is debate over what protected areas really mean, but still better that they're at least protected in name than not protected at all. And of course, the main pressure on the environment comes from the sheer number of human bodies that are consuming things. And contrary to predictions that there will be a catastrophe driven by an unstoppable human population explosion, we now know that population growth peaked in 1962, and it is actually plummeting worldwide. If you project population, taking into account the fact that as countries get richer, they have fewer babies. As they get more educated, they have fewer babies. And as women become empowered, they have fewer babies. It's possible that world population will peak in 2070 and then begin to decline. Now, with all of the facts and arguments that I have made, it's important not to draw two conclusions. One, that the improvements just happen by themselves in the natural course of events. No, they are products of specific prior developments. There is no law of the universe that says that environment will improve by itself, quite the contrary. But affluence and technology, as in the ways I've mentioned, and of course activism and policy, environmental protection agencies, mandated energy standards, endangered species protection, international and national clean air and water acts, pollution pricing, local movements, and much else. The other is, does this mean that we're on track to solve environmental problems? And the answer is clearly no, particularly when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So let me conclude just with some remarks on that, which I think is a unique environmental challenge and which probably should not just be merged with every other environmental problem. CO2 emissions, at first glance, it might seem that there is some progress because they leveled off, at least as of the year 2015, when I completed Enlightenment Now, the most recent data available. It's misleading in two ways, though. One is that they have since resumed an increase. A lot of this progress has come from the substitution of methane for coal because of the fracking revolution, particularly in the United States. But the reason that this should not be taken as a reassurance that we're moving in the right direction is that even if carbon emissions stayed flat, that would still mean adding 36 billion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. And it would mean that the CO2 that's already in there is going to continue to warm the atmosphere. What we really care about is temperature. And this graph has to come down to zero. Something that is just at least points the way toward not exactly optimism, but the steps that we ought to take, come from a historical data going back to the 19th century that shows that countries tend to follow an arc of carbon intensity. That is, how much CO2 is emitted per dollar of GDP that is produced. And as countries industrialize, as the Industrial Revolution happens, countries often capture a lot of energy by burning the most convenient source of energy, namely wood and coal, which are highly carbon intensive. But then there's a shift to petroleum, then to methane, to renewables like solar and wind, to nuclear, and the amount of carbon emitted per unit of wealth produced starts to decline. And this seems to happen everywhere. In China, it was even more radical. Actually, this graph, if I plotted it accurately, would kind of go up through the ceiling, and that's because during Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, peasants had to set up their own iron smelters in their backyard, which produced massive amounts of CO2 with zero economic output until China came to its senses. It's a reminder, by the way, that the cause of pollution and climate change is not capitalist governance, that communist governance could be worse. And India has reached a peak, and here's the graph for the world as a whole. Again, this does not mean that we're on track to solve the problem of climate change. For one thing, even as it takes less CO2 to produce a unit of wealth, we're producing more units of wealth, but also it's not enough for these even to decline. They have to go to zero, and we're not doing it. How do we deal with climate change? I have argued that we need a combination of policy, carbon pricing, most obviously, so that billions of people make decisions every day that all reduce the amount of carbon just to save money. But we also know that if that's the only thing you do, people will put on yellow vests and to spray paint the Arc de Triomphe and set cars on fire. So carbon pricing has to be combined with rebates so that the costs are not borne by the poor and the lower middle class. And technology. We need more zero carbon energy sources, including, and here I'm very happy to be controversial, I'm on the record for endorsing this, including following the example of our neighbor here, Sweden, and rapidly bringing out nuclear power as which is the most scalable and available and abundant source of energy that we know of. Also probably the safest, contrary to public perception. We're going to need to produce 8 times more electricity than we do now within the next 50 years to satisfy the demands from the developing world. Doing the math, nuclear is the only way that energy can come about. And as I won't go into this in any more detail, but most of the dread of nuclear power is irrational, Sweden being a proof of concept. And 4th generation nuclear tech can be even better. We may even have to go to negative carbon technologies, certainly planting more forests, but perhaps even carbon capture from the air, and at least consider the possibility of temporary geoengineering if all these fail and we really get to a point of crisis. But that may be for our descendants to worry about. So in sum, we are failing to deal with environmental problems. I think one problem is a counterproductive ideology, namely romantic environmentalism or 1970s greenism. I've argued for an alternative philosophy of environmentalism, eco-modernism, which acknowledges the benefits to humans of energy capture and economic development, seeks improvements in affluence, policy, and technology to deliver the maximum human benefit with the least environmental harm, acknowledging both the current progress and the remaining challenges. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Buhaug Solhjell, General Secretary of WWF. You have to speak fast, Buhaug.
Okay, thanks, and good morning, everyone. Good to see you, and honored to be here with you also, Professor Pinker. I'm a founder, a reader of your writings, and congratulations to PRIO with your 60th year anniversary, which is also exactly the same period, these exactly 60 years, where wars and armed conflicts have decreased steeply, and it can hardly be a coincidence, I think. Is there an optimistic way to panic? Because that's what I feel like doing. But on the other hand, basing myself on feeling feels a bit like blasphemy in front of Professor Pinker. So let me turn to what I believe to be the rational position. Deeply worried based on the facts, optimistic based on experience. Because the facts are deeply worrying. During the last year, 2 of the most important pieces of scientific work in modern times have emerged. The IPCC, known as the Climate Panel's report on consequences of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees global warming respectively, and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I prefer to call it the Nature Panel. I think they should call it that themselves also, so not to remain secret to the world for the rest of history. But those 2 panels have laid out the science for us, and they describe in plain language catastrophic consequences for nature, people, society, and our nature. If you are not able, and our economies, if you are not able to change policies drastically. And that change is extremely challenging. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we'll have to halve emissions from now until 2030. Then we will have to halve them again from 2030 to 2040. Then we will have to halve them again from 2040 to 2050. And to stop the loss of 1 million species or so and the destruction of ecosystem services like pollination, we need to massively increase the world's protected areas, both on land and sea. And we need to manage the rest of land and oceans much more sustainably. And we need to limit climate change to well below 1.5 degrees because it is also a driving force of the loss of nature. So on top of that, it's challenging because energy and land use, which created the problem, is deeply integrated into almost every aspect of our societies and economies. And this is where I think maybe Professor Pinker, in his otherwise impressive and important book, is not sufficiently pointing out the magnitude of the challenge. Because these environmental challenges, loss of biodiversity and climate, are not negative externalities of growth and development. They are the foundation of further growth and development themselves. We rely on nature for almost everything: food, clothes, medicines, water, pollination, a reasonably stable climate. And and it's also a fundamentally global problems. Many of the problems we deal with otherwise we can solve partly by ourselves. Climate change, global greenhouse emissions are fundamentally global. So you might want to panic, and feel free, we are very close to the Red Cross offices also here and Doctors Without Borders. I'm sure it will be handled. But you also might want to follow me through 4 reasons for real optimism despite of worrying facts, or even because of worrying facts. Because 1, the facts are also the reason why we know the enormous benefits that follow from reducing emissions and valuing nature. If we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees instead of 2, hundreds of millions of people will not be faced with climate risks, according to science. There will be 50% less acute shortage of clean drinking water. Some coral reefs may be saved on 1.5 degrees, while all will as opposed to none on 2 degrees. And 10 million fewer peoples will have to migrate because of natural disasters. Meaning, if you are afraid of migration, well, then you should be scared to death by climate change, really. And since we usually like to do what benefits ourselves, this is a real reason for hope, I think. Number 2, emissions are growing, but solutions are growing even more. In 2017, renewable energies grew more globally than all fossil fuels and nuclear together. The Earth is actually greener today than 20 years ago. NASA can teach us this, mainly because of tree planting programs and greening in China and India. Deforestation in Brazil is lower. All buses and taxis in the Chinese megacities of Shenzhen are now electric. Carbon pricing has been introduced in many countries. I could go on. It's not enough, but a lot more every year. 3, modern history has taught us that we humans have the ability to solve problems we created ourselves. World wars, famine, epidemics, totalitarian ideologies, natural disasters. Read Enlightenment now for more examples. Do you remember the hole in the ozone layer, any of you? Yeah, some of you, but you are old, right? Because young people, like me, young people don't remember this, because an international agreement, the Montreal Protocol, a new technology, has made it stop growing, and it is about to be fixed. But we desperately need to be able to do what Professor Pinker describes, I quote, to make reason the currency of our discourse. Or in Norwegian, fakta må ha makta. The power to settle an argument must lie with the facts. Or in the also in the words of the Nature panel, and I quote, the member state of IPBES panel have now acknowledged that by its very nature transformative change can expect opposition from those with interests vested in the status quo, but also that such opposition can be overcome for the broader public good. And thus, facts are an environmentalist's best friend in our work for change. Panic won't help, neither will inertia. A rational examination of the facts and expedient and flawless execution will. And that is unfortunately lacking today in dealing with the climate crisis. But crisis management can also teach us that it is not about panic, it's about stone, cold and rapid action. 4, kids. Based on experience, we know that a new generation can change things. They provide real reason for optimism, and despite all the panic rhetoric, do you know what Greta Thunberg and the movement is demanding in actual terms, in her own words to the EU Parliament? We want you to comply with the Paris Agreement and act on the IPCC reports. So there are 1.8 million kids school striking to take science seriously and in support of international agreements. Well, that's what I call enlightenment now. Thank you.
So, Elisabeth Gilmore, Associate Professor. The scene is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide my insights into what I see as one of the greatest environmental risks, that of climate change. I'm going to begin my comments by talking about climate science, in fact, in a pessimistic view. It's the process of cataloging climate impacts, of thinking about the challenges to mitigation, and thinking about the limits to adaptation to unavoidable risks. I'm going to conclude, though, by forwarding an optimistic view of science, a science which is reoriented to be actionable, to be embedded in societal objectives, objectives such as stable livelihoods, quality of life, current and future generational equity, and in such a tool that can help us identify societal outcomes that are consistent with climate policy. The science of climate change is rooted in fundamental physics. Increasing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide increase radiative forcing and result in increases in the mean global temperature. Right now, we're experiencing about a 1 degree Celsius rise over pre-industrial temperatures. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot when you think about variability of day-to-day weather. But this change in the global mean temperature is propagated into unpredictable and uncertain spatial patterns, which include heat waves, flooding, droughts, extreme weather, wildfires, sea level rise, and a myriad of changes in ecosystem functioning. And that's not all. There's still more to come. Emissions that have already been emitted of carbon dioxide have committed us to additional warming. Now, we can adapt to some of these changes. There are limits, and as the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius points out, there are major benefits to holding the global mean temperature increase to 1.5 over 2 degrees Celsius. And further, there are pathways which are available to meet this goal. I agree with Professor Pinker. Technology plays a critical role in helping us achieve these goals. And it's in all of the above. We need wind, we need solar, we need socially acceptable nuclear power. We also need net negative emissions. We have ideas about how to do this. Most of it involves harnessing our land system, planting trees, growing crops for energy, where we will combust them and then take the emissions and sequester them underground. But this climate policy, while it may keep us to 1.5 degrees Celsius, may also yield undesirable societal outcomes, like the erosion of indigenous land rights, land grabs in developing countries, and issues of food security. Having said this, is there any room for optimism? Or does climate science simply suggest that we will have undesirable outcomes from climate change and climate policy? I'm going to forward a piece of an optimistic view about what science can do. And in fact, it's a call to reorient climate science into something which is actionable, with the co-production of knowledge between scientists and those who intend to use it, decision makers and all of us in this room, facilitating a new dialogue. And I'll give you an example. I'll argue that one of the greatest challenges to enacting climate policy is, in fact, that we envision the world with this climate policy, say in 2050, looking very similar to the world today. This makes it look incredibly costly and very constraining. But now imagine a future with positive societal transformations of work, of leisure, of travel, of communication, and so on. Here, actionable climate science, embedded in shared societal goals with acceptable trade-offs and risks, can now allow us to map an achievable climate solution space that is more consistent with desirable, resilient, and sustainable futures. I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Halvard, you are a research professor at PRIO.
Thank you and good morning. And thank you also to Steve Pinker and my fellow panelists for insightful comments. Let me try to provide some additional perspectives from a slightly different angle. I will not be contrarian, I think. I will be complementary. And I will also try to be brief. So, why do we worry about climate change? It's not because of the increase in average yearly global temperature, I would argue. It's not because of changing precipitation patterns. It is not even because of melting of glaciers or increasing severity and frequency of extreme weather events. The main reason why we are concerned about climate change is the impacts that those physical changes in the climatic system might have on biological diversity, on ecosystems more generally, but perhaps most importantly, on human systems and livelihood. By mitigating climate change, limiting future greenhouse gas emissions, and also achieving scientific breakthrough in carbon capture and storage technologies, we may be able, and I think we will be able, to avoid some of the worst case scenarios, because we do not know how a 2-degree, 3-degree, 4-degree world will look like. The risk is significant, and the potential for dramatic impact is beyond what I think we can afford. So mitigation is fundamental to handling climate-induced risks. But risk and potential impact from climatic extremes depend not only on the characteristics of weather patterns in and of themselves. The impacts and the risks also depend on the vulnerability of affected social systems. And in fact, historically, if you look at variation in extreme weather events and variation in impact of those events on societies, on human lives lost, on economic costs, variation in vulnerability explains more of the outcome than variation in the physical characteristics of these weather extremes. Resilient societies, they have functioning early warning systems, they have robust infrastructure, their economies may be less dependent on and less sensitive to weather. And in Norway, which is not really an agrarian society, but even so, during the devastating heat and drought last summer, farmers were compensated on average 140,000 kroner. Norway is a resilient society. We can cope with extremes. Vulnerable societies may be less able to do so. The main cause of vulnerability to climatic changes is poverty and lack of development. And poverty and lack of development is driven in large part by political instability, fragile governments, and armed conflict. The recently concluded Millennium Development Goals project, they identified armed conflict as the key reason for failures to achieve MDG goals. And so I think that contains a piece of information. If you do care about immediate or short-term impacts of climatic extremes and also thinking more into the long-term future, how to limit humanitarian costs of climate change, mitigation is very important, but we shouldn't end there. If we can address the vulnerability of systems, social systems, we are likely to also be able to reduce future costs and consequences of climatic extremes. And there are reasons to be optimistic about that. I think both Pinker and the Foreign Minister referred to important progress of the last few decades. Allow me to be this old uncle for a little bit, now that our Minister of Foreign Affairs has left the room. Among the 10% poorest countries of the world in 1970, we have seen hardly any economic growth over the last 50 years. On average, the average country in the world has experienced considerable economic growth. The average global yearly growth rate since 1970 in terms of GDP per capita is 3.2%. For the 10% poorest countries, the average growth since 1970 has been 0.1%. And again, a main reason for that failure to develop is armed conflict and poor governance. We need to do something about that. And I will leave that as my final comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start with a question for you, Mr. Pinker. Isn't there a difference between the climate change and the challenges that we know from history? When we look at the rush that we need to be in to mitigate them, and that they will make irreversible changes to the planet we live on if we don't work faster.
Yeah, I agree with that. That climate change is really unlike past environmental problems, just at its sheer scale. How many human activities at present depend on emitting greenhouse gases. So it's an entirely different magnitude than, say, reducing oxides of nitrogen, for example, or sulfur dioxide, or untreated sewage. But I think some of the logic of how we ought to deal with the problem, even of another order of magnitude, carries over, but those solutions will have to be done at a much greater scale. Indeed, involving global cooperation, because unlike, say, cleaning up Boston Harbor, which Massachusetts can worry about, cleaning up the atmosphere, the whole world has to worry about.
Buhaug Solhjell, the nature of political rhetoric is to tell voters that the people who are now in power, they don't do nothing, they've achieved nothing, you have to vote for us, then perhaps we can fix this. Does that motivate voters, or do they become disillusioned?
No, it's politics at its worst. You always have to tell something negative about your opponent, and I think it's a major reason how the political discourse plays out. I think it's a major reason why people tend to underestimate success and progress, because we hear so much about the negative effects and so on, and it's not motivational. There's a Norwegian psychologist called Per Espen Stoknes. Many of you have, of course, be familiar with him, who's written about this, and he's showing that in a study of social media and media reports in Europe, up to 80% of the rhetoric and talk about climate change and environmental issues were negative. Only 20% neutral or positive. While what motivates us is hope, the feeling, yes, it's possible to do something, feeling of knowing and understanding solutions and so on. So I think actually it's a big problem also for motivating people to act.
Can I
Sure.
jump in and just add something? One thing that I did not mention and that did not come up in our various remarks is the role of politics and political polarization in dealing with climate change. I didn't mention, although I think it is a major impediment to dealing effectively with climate change, namely that climate change has become a left-wing issue, and that has been disastrous. Particularly in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world, such as in Brazil. And contrary to what I used to believe, especially as a scientist, that the main reason that people denied climate change is that they are scientifically illiterate, and if we just educated them more in climate science, then they would come around and be enlightened and see the truth. Turns out not to be true, that people who believe in climate change are no more sophisticated in their understanding of climate science than people who deny it. People who believe in climate change think that we should deal with it by cleaning up toxic waste dumps. Or that it's caused by nitrogen. I mean, they're clueless about the science. But if they are on the left, then they believe in climate change, and if they're on the right, they deny it. So this is and of course we see that in the policies of governments of the United States and Brazil, and to some extent other countries. And some of the actions that have been taken to combat climate change, like the Democratic Party's Green New Deal, I think are an utter disaster, because they even they strengthen the association between climate action and left-wing politics. And if we're going to, since dealing with it effectively requires global cooperation, which we are seeing the opposite of in the United States, Brazil, and elsewhere, that equation has to be severed, so that the entire political spectrum, not just the side that we're sympathetic to, will deal with it when they are in power. Some people say that the worst thing that happened to the climate change movement was when Al Gore made an inconvenient truth, because as a Democratic vice president and candidate for president, he branded it as a left-of-center issue.
Right. Elisabeth, Gilmore, you talked about the need for a new dialogue, and how can that dialogue be to mitigate this polarization in the debate?
Yes, I think this builds very nicely off of the idea that it's become highly politicized as an issue. But what I suggest as a way forward is, in fact, to not talk about climate policy in isolation from other societal goals that we have. I think we share more about ideas about stable livelihoods, about sort of the rhetoric of a better future for our children. And that by finding that space, we may also find a better space for climate policy. I think as long as we continue to think about it in terms of just today's conditions, it will continue to have that sense of polarization on issues of economic growth, issues of constraining activities, asking me to do things I don't want to do. But if we can link it to things that in fact are highly aspirational, we may do much better as far as moving ourselves forward.
So, Halvard, Buhaug, bad governance, conflict, violence. I mean, if you live in that kind of a society, the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning isn't how can I cut emissions. But that is also part of the complexity of the debate. So how do you bring that into a debate that is already polarized?
It's a good question, although I think we also need to be honest that people who live today in many of those societies that are characterized by failed governance and also suffer from repeated political violence, those are not the societies that have contributed significantly to the global warming that we are experiencing. So in that sense, we shouldn't expect them to be the first to cut emissions of greenhouse gases. That's our responsibility. Instead, we should try to help them build more robust political structures. Now, how to do that is the question number one for me. But I think there's a lot of positive development going on. And although I was the old uncle a minute ago, there are good signs as well. I mean, and even this afternoon there will be a seminar on the latest update from the Uppsala PRIO conflict data, where we will see that although the number of conflicts have increased in the last few years, we again see a decline in the number of casualties due to conflict. And I think the role of the UN in terms of mediation, in terms of peace building, is really, really important. And to the extent that we are able as an international community to contribute to make the UN even stronger, I think that is one way forward.
Buhaug.
No, just on the policy discussion that Mr. Pinker introduced here, I'm actually a bit more optimistic of how this has developed, especially in Europe. I think it's fair to say now the climate change is widely accepted, except from on the very populist right. For instance, the most important European politician on climate change the last decade is Connie Hedegaard, I think, the former EU commissioner. She's a conservative Christian Democrat from Denmark. And in the European elections now, climate change was issue number 2 for voters and number 1 for voters below 30 years. So I think it has changed here.
I agree.
Less so probably in the US, but still also, if you look around the world, where left-right doesn't mean as much, like in China. You can like it or not, but China is probably the country in the world right now where action is most, where most things are happening on climate change, and where this or left-right-wing thing doesn't really mean anything. So I'm also there a bit more optimistic. And just this weekend I saw new numbers from the US. More than 70% of the population now says that they think climate change is created by humans, so the majority of the rise in global temperature, which is not so far from the European average, actually. But of course, in your polity, things are very different.
No, I think that's absolutely right. That the polls show that I think in every country but Pakistan, a majority of people accept anthropogenic climate change. I don't know why not Pakistan, but and I think it's not just the populist right, because at least in the United States it's also the libertarian right.
Yeah.
And the libertarians and the populists can't stand each other, but they seem to both agree in denying human-made climate change. Although that too may be changing even within right-wing libertarian movements. But I agree that there is room for some optimism there, partly because of the generational turnover, that as you go younger, then you get fewer and fewer climate change deniers.
But even if you have a majority believing in why the changes are coming, then the solutions are now creating the conflict. I mean, and you have the equality discussion, inequality discussion, who's going to pay for all the mitigation. There you have a conflict growing.
Indeed, and I think part of the, I think part of the problem is that the mitigation policies tend to be folded, at least in the United States, with a number of other left and liberal agendas items, which I think confuses the debate, gets in the way of dealing with the number one challenge, which is climate, and something that I think they really ought to be unbundled for a number of reasons.
Do you agree on that, Elisabeth, that they ought to be unbundled? You talked earlier about a new society that we should vision, and that's also then you're straight into the political conflict.
Well, I think it's both political but also not. I mean, we can imagine a number of ways of describing what we'd like the future to look like. That can be done in small groups. That can be done through more political processes. But what I am trying to forward in my comments is not that we don't need climate policy, but rather that if we treat it solely as in isolation from all of these other features that we care about. And I think we speak to these things. We know about, economic development is important. We know that governance is important. We also know about things that we simply believe are important, like equity and justice. And that by coupling a climate policy within this aspirational world, I think that we will move things forward. I think by treating it in isolation, we in fact make it much more challenging to reach those goals. And that's why specifically I sort of forward an idea of a more actionable science to in fact inform these decisions that we're going to have to make.
I love the term actionability, and I think it's more relevant than optimism, that it should be Earth actionability. Namely, what will get us from here to there if we do the math and we figure out how much energy we use, how much energy other countries use, how much more energy they will be using, because economic growth, especially in poor countries, is a really, really good thing. What is actually going to deliver the number of BTUs that the world needs while bringing emissions down to zero? This is it's mind-boggling, but we have to do that math and figure out, and the policies are going to be, it's going to be such an enormous global effort to get there that I argue that while I love the idea of coupling it to not so politicized goals, like the world our children will live in, like employment, like technology, things that at least in rhetoric the left and right could possibly agree on, that kind of political rhetoric, finding the common ground, the catchphrases that have not yet become tainted by being left-wing or right-wing slogans. If you link those to climate change, then I think there is some hope that the actionable policies might actually be acted upon.
So I know that several of you have hoped to be able to ask some questions, and now I will open up for questions. Aspen Bottaida, you just put your hand in the air.
First, thank you everyone for a fantastic
Sorry, can you use the microphone?
Yes, if I get one.
Thanks, I'm Espen Bartheid. I'm the Labour Party Energy and Climate spokesperson, and I'm working intensely now with other parties on the centre left to think about a holistic approach to how to actually
change. And I have, I very much like your presentation, but I have to say, I think the dream of unbundling is impossible. It won't work in the real life politics. It would be good, because I do agree that this is issue number one, so we put it above everything else. But in reality, you need to develop new industries to replace old ones. You need to deal with winners and losers. You need to deal with geographic and societal differences, and you need to deal with resistance, and you need to deal with distribution and tax system. This is politics, essential politics. So the tools we have available, even in an advanced welfare state like Norway, require sort of a very coherent policy, which indeed puts climate in its center, but which looks into several other aspects that are the tools by which we change. And while I very much agree with Bård Vegar's point that here in Europe there's a much broader acceptance than I think in US at the federal level, although I see a number of US states where there is much more cohesion on this. I just visited California, where even the Republicans are heavily engaged in this, but more in Europe. But I still think that we simply have to admit I'm a politician of the left, but I still think there, serious climate action for the next 10 years doesn't fit very well with the Washington consensus. It doesn't sort of work together. You can't just have goals. You need sort of active policies. You need a strong state. You need sort of strong directional politics. And if you don't have that, it won't work. So the unpolitical climate policy is a little bit difficult in my view. I hope I'm wrong, but I think I'm right.
Can I say something about that? Oh, I agree that there's no way that you could make massive changes that are going to be required to mitigate climate change without some very sophisticated political action. I mean, the example that I briefly mentioned of, say, carbon taxes in France, which turned out to be a disaster. I mean, this is what almost every economist agrees. We need carbon taxes in order to deal with the challenge. So Macron does the right thing, he puts in carbon taxes, and people put on yellow vests and start burning cars. So clearly he was not
because he forgot about the distributional effect.
Exactly. So he was not an astute enough politician. So the question is not. So just to let me clarify. It clearly cannot be divorced from the political process. But what I'm really calling for is that for it to be divorced from the highly tribal, ideological, polarized left-right dimension, which, since the center-left is just not always going to be in power, sometimes it's going to be the center-right or the populist right. And the question is, during those years, are all the steps taken to mitigate climate just going to go backwards, so the world cannot make any progress? When there's a left-wing government, there's progress. When there's a right-wing government, the progress is undone or reversed. That's not going to work. It's got to be that the political process is at least somewhat, to the extent that we can, divorced from the highly tribal, identity-based coalitions that in a democracy are going to shift the political power every 4 or 8 years.
So we have more questions. Could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. Okay, I'm Camilla Halvard. I'm a journalist in Aftenposten, and I would like to ask Mr. Pinker about you make a case for eco-modernism or more pragmatic take on the climate changes. And I was wondering, because it seems there's a generation thing and there's a lot of activism and a lot of what you call romantic greenism. And I think this makes people feel important, and that it's meaningful that they're doing something important. And moving into pragmatism and logic, reason, will take some of that away from them. And I wondered if you have some solutions about how to make that transition into a more pragmatic stance towards solutions, because that seems to me to be the real problem with all of this, because it's very emotion driven and it's very it gives people a lot of sense of identity and meaning by engaging.
Yes, I think that's a good question, and as a psychologist, I certainly recognize the importance of emotion in motivating people. But the challenge is, how do you align the emotion with the reason, so that while kindling the passion in people so that they do something, what they do actually solves the climate crisis? Because I think a lot of environmental activities make people feel good. They're great for the emotions, and they do zero or sometimes have negative effects. And I confess, for example, I was part of a campaign at Harvard University to unplug your chargers when you're not using your computer. Now this will, I post for posters, and they quoted me, and it felt great, but clearly the whole world can unplug their chargers, and it's not going to solve the climate change problem. So while not disagreeing with the necessity of mobilizing people's emotions, we've got to mobilize it in a way that our logic and reason tell us will actually bring carbon emissions to zero.
Just wanted to comment because I thought the dichotomy you set up here was interesting, but also a bit surprising, because you argue very well here and in your book that the climate change issue shouldn't be too politicized or too part of a broader ideology, right? There has to be room for both conservative approaches and more social democratic left-wing ones. And I think the same when it comes to environmental ideologies. There's room for different ways to approach it. There's room for the degrowth, very growth skeptical, maybe romantic approach, and also an extremely technologically optimistic approach, and probably other approaches, as long as we remain based on reason and base ourselves on our best knowledge. So, I would go with the Pope if his arguments were the best, but I don't think they are. So that's that. But there has to be room for many approaches in this important issue, I think.
One more question back there.
Yes, Asbjørn Torvanger from CICERO, the Center for International Climate Research. A very good discussion. I have two comments. First one is that I will warn against presenting climate as an environmental problem, because that gives the impression that this is something you can find a simple solution to, which is not true, of course, because climate is about fundamentally how we organize our economies, the energy system, and societies globally. Second comment is there's one dimension here I think you have talked too little about, because we are talking about mitigation actions to reduce the climate challenge problem, and that raises a number of, it raises cost, who's paying for these actions, and there are conflicts of interest. And we all know that there are countries and there are companies that are into fossil fuels and other, let's say, activities that do not care so much about harder or, let's say, higher carbon prices or more stringent climate policies. And of course they are opposing it. Sometimes they're even running campaigns to kind of influencing the public opinion on this. So this is one of the barriers, and I think there's too little emphasis on that. And this is both in the kind of industry level and national level. Also, just to add on that, we also know that you talk about, well, we need to increase carbon taxing. Yes, of course we do. But we also know that there are huge subsidies today, both on production and consumption of fossil fuels. And as far as I know, they are actually bigger than the subsidies on renewable energy.
Yeah. So
any comments on that?
Yeah. No, I think those are all completely valid points. I would add, though, that I think there is a tendency to, at least in the United States, to try to find the villains for climate change, to demonize the Koch brothers in the United States and the fossil fuel industry. But at least until through 2015, the United States actually did a better job at reducing CO2 emissions than most European countries, simply because of the huge conversion from coal to methane because of fracking. So something that sheer economics, led to that. Whereas in some European countries, by shifting, like in Germany, by shifting from nuclear to renewables, which were in effect are backed up by coal, because renewables simply couldn't make up the gap, the carbon emissions stayed flat. So paradoxically, simply having the good intentions and identifying the people who are working against climate change may not actually drive the numbers in the direction that we want. And paradoxically, the United States, the most climate-denying country, made some of the greatest progress. I mean, not sustainable. It can't just convert to methane forever, because methane is a greenhouse gas. but it just shows that the direction of the change can sometimes be independent of the stated motivations of the various players.
Maybe a comment from you?
Yeah, just following up on that and referring to the last question. So I think Norway, a little bit ironically, can be one example of a case where sound policies and conscious subsidies can change consumers' behaviors. So Norway is one of the major emitters. If we include offshore activities, we like to focus on onshore activities only. That makes us look better. But if you look outside of the cars, right, every second car that is sold in Norway today, every second new car that is sold, is either fully electric or is hybrid. It's a dramatic transformation in just a few years. It's one small step, but it is a step, and I think it is one case where sound policies can make consumers change their behavior in a more environmentally friendly manner.
Elisabeth?
I'd like to add to that. One area where we actually see a lot of climate action is on the university campuses in the United States. Several universities have made commitments to reducing their emissions quite dramatically. And in fact, in doing so, you have a whole generation of students who are having positive experiences around actionable climate policy. And I think what this shows is that we've moved a long way from just thinking we tell people about the science and they act, or people have experiences with the negative impacts of climate change and so they act, but rather that by gaining experience with positive outcomes from climate policy, it's that will drive more action.
Can I add something to that, just because, again, I was part of the campaign at Harvard University for the campaign called Green is the New Crimson, or crimson, of course, being Harvard's color. And I think I'm okay with that, but on the whole, universities probably contribute a very, very small proportion of greenhouse gas emissions, and probably the biggest, I argue, that the biggest contribution of the university is not to feel good about their own contribution, although I agree that bringing up a generation of students to whom the issue is salient helps. But universities should be the places where you have the most in-depth analysis of what's not only changing the climate, but what's changing people's psychology, how people can come around to supporting it, and what are going to be the technologies that give us zero carbon and eventually negative carbon technologies. And if I were to, if the president of Harvard had listened to me, it would be forget about the campaign to unplug chargers, forget about putting up a wind turbine that's a supply some tiny percentage of Harvard's electricity, but rather fund a new center for, maybe one center for carbon capture and another center for the psychology of climate change, because I think that's where universities can make even a bigger difference.
So we are heading towards the end. I would like to thank the panel for engaging in this discussion and for very good questions from you, and hoping that the rest of the debate, that's a small hope, can concentrate on the gains from mitigation and climate policy more than the sacrifice and sharing the burdens. Thank you very much.